I was standing behind a man at the DMV last week, the kind of place where the air is already thick with impatience. When he finally reached the counter, the clerk asked for his name, and for a heartbeat, I thought the man was playing a prank. He just stopped. His mouth remained open, his jaw tightened, and his eyes began to blink rapidly as if he were trying to shake off a physical glitch. The clerk looked up, tapping her pen, and I'll admit, for a second, I thought he was just being difficult or had suddenly blanked on his own identity. Behind me, a woman let out a loud, theatrical sigh and checked her watch. To everyone in that line, it looked like a choice, a lack of focus, or perhaps just a strange, sudden bout of nerves. But then the sound finally bit through. It wasn't a name. It was just the first consonant of his name, repeated over and over like a needle stuck in the groove of a record. In that moment, his face didn't look anxious. It looked purely exhausted. It was the expression of someone running a full-speed marathon just to cross the street. What the impatient crowd didn't see, what most of us never realize, was that his brain was sending a perfectly clear signal to speak, but the execute button was physically jammed. We saw a delay. He was experiencing a neurological blackout. That invisible wall between a thought and the words used to express it is the daily reality for 80 million people worldwide. It isn't caused by a traumatic childhood or a shaky set of nerves, and it certainly isn't a lack of intelligence. It is a fundamental timing error in the brain's wiring, a disconnect that turns the simplest conversation into a high-stakes battle. To understand why those words won't come, we have to look past the surface and into the fascinating, often misunderstood science of the stuttering brain.
Right. And when you describe that guy freezing at the counter, what's so striking is that the people in line behind you probably just assumed he was having a moment of panic.
Oh, totally. You could feel the judgment in the room.
Exactly. Or, that he was just intimidated by the situation. But what we're actually observing in that precise moment is, well, it's not a psychological hesitation at all.
Right.
It's a profound, measurable, physiological event. When that man at the counter physically froze, his brain was experiencing a real-time disruption in the cortico-basal ganglia thalamocortical loop.
Whoa, okay. The cortico-basal what?
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
For those of us who, don't have an advanced degree in neurology, what does that actually mean in plain English?
Right. And different neighborhoods handle different tasks.
Yeah.
So you have areas that come up with the words you want to say, areas that process what you're hearing, and areas that actually control your muscles. To get a message from the idea neighborhood to the muscle neighborhood, the signal has to travel down a very specific highway.
Right.
That highway is a neural circuit that loops from your cortex, which is the outer layer of your brain where complex thought happens, down into the deep central structures.
Like the basal ganglia.
Exactly. The basal ganglia and the thalamus, and then back up again.
So it's basically a closed-loop system for sending commands?
And to understand developmental stuttering, we have to completely divorce ourselves from the mythologies of nervousness or trauma or like poor parenting.
Which is what everyone assumes, right?
Exactly. But this is a fundamental neurological condition. It's a mechanical failure in that specific loop, the motor timing pathways.
So it's a hardware issue.
It's a hardware issue that strips away the fluidity of speech that, well, the rest of the world just takes entirely for granted.
That distinction is so crucial because when you actually look at how this glitch physically manifests in the real world, it isn't just one single behavior, is it? Because researchers and speech therapists, they sort of categorized the surface level reality of stuttering into 3 distinct phases. And the first one is probably what most people picture when they hear the word stutter, which is repetitions.
Right. That's the classic involuntary repeating of a sound or a syllable or maybe a whole word.
Exactly. It's that needle stuck in the groove of a record. Like, see, can you hear me? The sound is coming out, but the system is just looping.
Yeah, the motor system is firing, but it keeps resetting.
Right. And then you have the second phase, which is prolongations. This is where a single sound is stretched out abnormally long way past its natural lifespan in a sentence.
Like someone saying, me name is.
Exactly, where the airflow continues, but the actual articulation is totally stalled. But the third phase, the one that you were just talking about at the DMV.
The block.
Right, the block, which often looks the most agonizing from the outside.
It does. Because a block is a total cessation of airflow. From a physiological standpoint, a block is perhaps the most visceral demonstration of this neurological misfire.
What's actually happening in the throat when that happens?
Well, if you were to look inside the throat during a severe block, you would see the vocal folds close tightly together. The mouth might be open, the jaw might be moving, the lungs are trying to push air up, but absolutely zero sound escapes.
Wow.
The person is completely physically trapped in that millisecond.
Imagine you're holding your breath underwater, and your lungs are just burning, demanding that you exhale, but your throat simply refuses to open. That physical sensation of being locked, and that's happening just to say, hello.
That's a very accurate physical comparison, actually. And the reason they're trapped brings us deep into the architecture of the brain, back to that neighborhood we just mentioned.
The basal ganglia.
Yes. If we want to understand stuttering in this deep dive, we have to understand this specific cluster of neurons. The basal ganglia basically acts as the brain's gatekeeper for movement. It's the internal metronome.
So, to be clear, it's not the part of the brain that comes up with the words. It doesn't write the script.
No.
It's just the part that organizes how we physically produce the script.
Exactly. The language centers of your brain, specifically areas like Broca's area, which handles language formulation, and Wernicke's area, which handles comprehension, they're working perfectly.
They're doing their job.
They're forming the thoughts, selecting the vocabulary from your mental dictionary, constructing the grammar flawlessly. The intent to speak is completely intact.
So the script is written, printed, and ready to go.
Exactly. But speaking aloud requires an impossibly complex, precise sequence of muscle movements. I mean, it is arguably the most complex motor task human beings perform.
More than like throwing a baseball.
Absolutely. We're talking about the microsecond coordination of over 100 distinct muscles. Your respiratory system has to push the exact right volume of air. Your larynx has to adjust vocal cord tension to produce the right pitch. Your jaw, your lips, your tongue, your soft palate, they all have to move in a highly specific, overlapping choreography.
When you lay it out like that, it's honestly a miracle any of us can speak at all.
It truly is a biomechanical marvel. And the basal ganglia's job is to manage the timing of that choreography. It's supposed to provide the go signal for each sequential movement.
Okay, so it's like a traffic light.
Yes. You finish the B sound, the basal ganglia fires a signal to release those muscles and immediately engage the muscles for the A sound. But in someone who stutters, brain imaging reveals a distinct mismatch between the cortical areas planning the speech and the basal ganglia executing it.
The timing signals are corrupted.
Exactly. The basal ganglia fails to open the gate and the motor system fires entirely out of sync.
Which brings us to the profound paradox of this condition. I want to bring in a story that perfectly illustrates how bizarre this basal ganglia dysfunction can look from the outside.
Oh, the percussionist story.
Yes, Elias. Let's look at how that internal metronome behaves in different contexts. So imagine a teenager named Elias. The year is 1998. He's standing in a damp, slightly chilly rehearsal hall in North London. The air smells heavily of rosin and old wood, and the acoustics are bouncing off these high vaulted ceilings. Elias is a percussionist, and when he's standing behind the snare drum, his physical timing is impeccable. He literally exists in the microspaces between the beats.
Right. His motor coordination in that specific context is world-class.
Completely world-class. His hands execute these incredibly complex, rapid-fire motor sequences without a fraction of a second of hesitation. He can play a polyrhythm that would make your head spin.
But then the context changes.
Exactly. The rehearsal ends. The conductor steps down from the podium, points to Elias, and asks him to simply introduce the next piece to the rest of the youth orchestra.
And this is where the highly specific nature of the neurological miswire becomes visible to everyone in the room.
Right. The gate in his brain, the basal ganglia, simply refuses to swing open for speech. He feels the title of the piece, the word symphony, sitting right there on the tip of his tongue.
The concept is fully formed.
He knows exactly what he wants to say. Yet his motor system starts firing completely out of sync. It's like a corrupted file trying to load on a computer screen. He stands there in that damp room, his jaw locked, his eyes wide. The silence stretches out. 4 seconds. It feels like a physical weight pressing down on everyone in the room. And the tragedy is the other musicians think he's having a panic attack.
They assume stage fright.
Exactly. But it wasn't anxiety. It was a rhythmic mismatch between his intent and his execution. The vulnerability in his eyes wasn't because he forgot the word or because he was intimidated by the string section. It was because his own internal clock had violently betrayed him in front of the very people who consider tempo to be a sacred science.
That is such a brilliant, heartbreaking illustration because it forces us to ask, how is that possible? How can someone have impeccable physical rhythm on a drum, but completely lose motor timing for speech?
It seems like a massive contradiction.
It does, until you look at the neural pathways. Elias's basal ganglia functions perfectly when governing the motor loops required for his hands and arms to strike a drum.
Because it's a different pathway.
The rhythmic predictability of music, the physical act of playing an instrument that engages entirely different neural pathways. It often recruits supplementary motor areas in the brain that completely bypass the primary glitch area.
So drumming takes the back roads, avoiding the traffic jam.
But the spontaneous, highly volatile motor sequence of spoken language relies heavily on a specific dopamine-driven pathway within the basal ganglia.
Ah, dopamine.
Right. It requires split-second, constantly changing initiation signals. And when that specific speak circuit is called upon, the coordination breaks down.
So it's kind of like, imagine you have a high-end, phenomenally powerful computer. It's got the best processor, massive amounts of RAM. This machine can render complex, multi-layered 3D graphics flawlessly at 100 frames per second.
Follow.
That's Elias on the snare drum. But the absolute second you try to open a basic text document like Microsoft Notepad, the whole system freezes. The cursor turns into a spinning wheel of death.
Analogy.
It feels totally incomprehensible from the outside. You look at the computer and you think, if it can render a 3D universe, why on earth can't it open a tiny text file? You assume it must be broken entirely.
Right, but it isn't about the objective difficulty of the task.
It is about which specific software pathway the hardware is trying to use. The 3D rendering uses the graphics card, which works great. The text document is trying to access a corrupted sector on the hard drive.
And that hardware analogy is the exact right framework to use moving forward. Because this specific targeted miswiring is not a random glitch acquired from a person's environment.
It's not something they picked up along the way.
No. It's not a software bug introduced by a stressful event or a demanding parent or like a traumatic experience with a dog when they were 2 years old.
Right.
The architecture of that basal ganglia circuit is hard-coded into the individual's biology, which means we have to trace this all the way back.
Yeah.
We have to look at the genetic origins.
Right. Stuttering runs deeply in families, and the moment we start talking about the hereditary nature of this condition, we have to be extraordinarily clear because there are so many myths to debunk here. We aren't talking about learned behavior.
Oh.
It isn't a case of a child unconsciously mimicking a parent's speech patterns because they hear it every day. We are talking about deep-coded instructions in our DNA.
Yeah, in recent years, researchers have isolated specific genetic mutations linked directly to familial stuttering.
And what are the names of those genes?
The most notable ones are variants in the GMPT-TAB, GMPTG, and NEDGPA genes.
Okay.
And the discovery of these specific genes was a watershed moment in the field. It fundamentally shifted the paradigm of how the medical community views stuttering.
Because before that, they thought it was psychological.
Completely. For decades, the search for a cause was entirely focused on psychology or gross muscular mechanics. Doctors thought it was an anxious temperament or a weak tongue.
A weak tongue, really?
Yeah, but these genes, GMPTB, GMPTG, and NADGPA, they don't govern the muscles of the tongue. They don't govern the anxiety centers of the amygdala.
So what do they govern?
They govern fundamental cellular biology. They are responsible for a microscopic process known as the lysosomal enzyme targeting pathway.
We just took a massive leap. We went from the basal ganglia in the brain right down into a microscope looking at the inside of a single cell. What is the lysosomal enzyme targeting pathway?
Think of every single cell in your body as a tiny, bustling city. And just like any city, a cell produces waste. Proteins wear out, molecules break down.
Makes sense.
If that waste isn't cleared out, the city becomes toxic and shuts down. The lysosomes are essentially the recycling centers or the garbage disposals of our cells. They contain specific enzymes that break down and process this cellular waste.
Okay, so lysosomes are the garbage disposals.
Now, to work properly, those lysosomes need their specific enzymes delivered to them constantly. These three genes, GMP-TAB, GMPTG, and NADGPA, are the logistical dispatchers.
See.
They're responsible for tagging those enzymes and routing them to the lysosomes so the garbage disposals can actually do their job.
So they basically write the shipping labels.
When there is a mutation in these genes, the shipping labels get messed up. The enzymes don't reach the lysosomes efficiently. The intracellular recycling process is disrupted.
But wait, if this is a problem with cellular garbage disposal, how on earth does that cause a person to physically block on the letter P when they're trying to order a pizza? That seems like a massive disconnect.
You have just hit upon the grand, enduring mystery in the science of stuttering. It's called the cascade effect.
Effect.
Yeah. How does a tiny mutation in a microscopic waste management system selectively disrupt the incredibly complex, large-scale neural pathways required for fluid speech?
Right. Do we have any idea? Or is it just a total black box?
Well, we don't have the definitive final answer, but we have very strong leading theories. The prevailing hypothesis is that certain types of brain cells, specifically the highly specialized neurons in the basal ganglia that manage split-second motor timing, are exquisitely sensitive to metabolic waste.
Ah, meaning they need a perfectly clean environment to fire fast enough.
Exactly. These neurons are firing hundreds of times a second to coordinate your lips, tongue, and vocal cords. If the lysosomes in those specific neurons aren't clearing out waste fast enough because of the genetic mutation, toxic proteins might slightly build up.
So it clogs the system.
It doesn't kill the cell, but it makes it sluggish. It introduces a micro delay. And in a system that relies on millisecond precision, a micro delay in the go signal from the basal ganglia causes the whole speech motor loop to crash.
So the genetic mutation causes...
Right. Males only have one X chromosome, so they don't have a backup copy. Alternatively, it could be that estrogen promotes stronger neuroplasticity in the speech centers during early brain development, allowing females to rewire around the basal ganglia glitch more effectively than males. The exact mechanism remains one of the most active frontiers of this research. But what is absolutely undeniable, regardless of gender, is that this is a biological inheritance.
And when we talk about inheritance, it usually sounds so clinical, genetic predisposition. But I was reading an account about a family in Lahore, Pakistan, that grounds this science in something deeply human.
Yes, I know the story you're talking about.
For 3 generations, the men and women in this family carried a very specific, quiet cadence to their speech.
A shared genetic footprint.
Yes, a sun-drenched courtyard in Lahore. Dust motes are drifting in the heavy, warm afternoon air. A young girl named Zoya is sitting on a woven mat watching her grandfather. He is trying to tell a story about his own youth. As she watches him, he hits a block. But he doesn't look panicked. He doesn't look anxious. He just looks incredibly weary.
A weariness that comes from decades of physical exertion just to communicate basic thoughts.
Yes. It is as if he is navigating a familiar, rocky, uphill path that he has walked 1,000 times before. He knows exactly where he is going to trip, and he just has to push through it.
Yeah.
What Zoya is watching isn't a lack of confidence. She is watching the physical manifestation of the GNPTT mutation in real time. She is watching that cellular process, that lysosomal enzyme targeting we just talked about, disrupting the neural pathways required for her grandfather to fluidly share his past.
And how does Zoya view her own speech in relation to his?
That's the most striking part. For Zoya, her own stutter isn't a mystery to be solved. It isn't a curse to be lifted or some psychological failing. Heirloom. Right. There is a profound, albeit painful, intimacy in knowing that the physical block in your own throat is a direct biological echo of your ancestors. It is a shared piece of broken code. It makes the simple act of naming a child or telling a story in a courtyard a feat of genetic endurance that binds her family together.
An heirloom.
It makes me think of inheriting a beautiful vintage pocket watch from a grandparent. You look at the face of the watch and you notice that the second hand skips a little bit every time it reaches the 12.
Right.
It just stutters for a second before ticking forward. And then you look at your own watch, the one you've always had, and you realize it skips in exactly the same way, at exactly the same moment. Except this heirloom isn't sitting in your pocket.
No.
It is embedded in your DNA, dictating how you interface with the entire world from the moment you begin to speak.
But that genetic embedding also dictates when the condition manifests. Because the code is present from birth, yes, but a newborn doesn't stutter. The genetic vulnerability sits there, waiting for the right developmental pressure to expose it. Which brings us to the critical window of childhood.
If it's hard-coded at birth, why on earth does it only show up when a kid is 3 or 4 years old? Why aren't they stuttering their very first words?
To answer that, we have to quickly delineate the 3 recognized categories of stuttering, because they have drastically different origins, and history has tragically conflated them.
Let's do that, because the historical misdiagnosis is honestly infuriating.
So the first category, which is what we're focusing on in this deep dive, is developmental stuttering. This is the genetic, basal ganglia-driven condition that affects millions. But then you have a second category, neurogenic stuttering.
Neurogenic, meaning originating in the nervous system from a specific event.
Correct. This occurs when an adult who has spoken fluently their entire life suddenly begins to stutter following a distinct neurological trauma.
Like an injury.
Yes. They have a stroke, or they suffer a traumatic brain injury in a car crash, or they develop a neurodegenerative disease like Parkinson's. In these cases, the brain's established, perfectly functioning speech pathways have been acutely physically damaged.
So the hardware was fine, but it got smashed.
Exactly. Then there's the third category, psychogenic stuttering.
And this is the one that causes all the trouble and all the myths.
Yes. Psychogenic stuttering is exceedingly rare. It occurs as a result of severe, acute, catastrophic psychological trauma. The brain is so overwhelmed by trauma that the speech centers essentially short-circuit.
Like a soldier returning from a war zone with shell shock.
Exactly. But historically, the medical establishment vastly aggressively overdiagnosed psychogenic stuttering. They couldn't see the genetic markers, they couldn't scan the basal ganglia, so what did?
They blamed the patient, or they blamed the parents.
They absolutely did. They routinely and incorrectly misattributed genetic developmental stuttering to emotional trauma or neuroticism. Psychoanalysts, heavily influenced by Freud, would tell mothers that their child was stuttering because the mother was too overbearing, or because the child had unresolved subconscious conflicts.
It makes my blood boil. Think about the immeasurable harm that caused to families.
I was devastated.
A mother brings in her 4-year-old child who has a genetic cellular mutation, and the doctor tells her he's stuttering because you didn't love him correctly during potty training. And that's just the psychological side. When you look back at the physical treatments from past centuries, it is genuinely horrifying. We're talking about a biological hardware issue in the deep brain. And in the 1840s, surgeons were performing actual operations on the tongues of people who stuttered. They were cutting wedges of muscle tissue out of the tongue without anesthesia, trying to fix a basal ganglia timing error.
It was barbaric.
It is the ultimate danger of looking at a fundamental hardware problem and being arrogant enough to believe you can solve it with a knife or with a crude psychological software patch.
Which is exactly why we have to be so precise about developmental stuttering. The form rooted in those GMPT tape and NAGPA genes, it almost always begins in childhood, specifically in that incredibly volatile developmental window between the ages of 2 and 5.
Okay, so back to my earlier question. Why age 2 to 5? If the genes are there on day 1, why wait?
Because that specific window is a period of explosive cognitive growth. Think about what a toddler's brain is attempting to do. It's acquiring language vocabulary, syntax, complex grammar, at an astonishing, unprecedented velocity.
It's basically downloading an entire operating system.
There is essentially a massive race happening inside the brain.
A race between what and what?
Between the cognitive demand and the physical supply. The linguistic networks, the parts of the brain wanting to express complex thoughts, are expanding massively and rapidly. But the speech motor system, the physical wiring in the basal ganglia required to actually move the mouth and tongue, takes longer to mature physically. In a typically developing brain, the motor system keeps up just enough. But in a brain carrying the genetic predisposition for stuttering, the motor timing mechanisms in the basal ganglia are already vulnerable.
They have that micro delay from the cellular waste.
Right. So when you suddenly flood that vulnerable system with a massive demand to speak complex 3-part sentences, it simply cannot keep pace. The system overloads. The coordination breaks down.
It's like taking a beautifully designed sports car that has a slightly faulty fuel injector. If you just drive it 20 miles an hour around the neighborhood, which is like a toddler just saying mama or milk, the car runs fine. You don't even notice the flaw. But the second you take that car onto the highway and floor the accelerator, which is the toddler trying to say, mama, I want the red cup because the blue one is dirty, the fuel injector can't keep up with the demand, and the engine violently sputters and stalls.
That is a phenomenal analogy. The cognitive demand outstrips the physical motor capacity. But here is where the data gets really fascinating. The outcome of that breakdown is not uniform. If we look at composite clinical cases that reflect the broad data, we see drastically different trajectories for these kids.
Examples, take a 4-year-old boy. Out of nowhere, he suddenly begins repeating the first sounds of words. He comes into the kitchen and says, ball.
Right, highly typical.
His parents are instantly alarmed, they panic, but by the time he is 7 years old, the stutter has vanished entirely, like it was never there. His speech is completely indistinguishable from his peers.
And that boy represents the statistical majority. The research consistently shows that anywhere from 65 to 80% of children who begin stuttering in that developmental window will recover naturally. Usually this happens before puberty. And as we noted earlier with the gender disparity, young girls tend to recover both more frequently and earlier than boys.
But wait, if the genetic code is already there and the mutation is permanently in their DNA, how can 80% of them just recover? Do the genes just magically fix themselves?
No, the genes don't change. The recovery happens because of the astonishing neuroplasticity of the developing brain.
The brain's ability to rewire itself.
Exactly. During early childhood, the brain is highly malleable. It is constantly pruning unused neural connections and strengthening efficient ones. It is building the highway system.
Right.
In that 65 to 80% of children who recover, it appears the developing brain essentially recognizes the timing mismatch in the basal ganglia. It realizes, hey, this pathway is constantly jamming.
So it finds a detour.
Yes. Because it is still plastic, it successfully reroutes the speech signals. It builds a bypass. It finds a more efficient neural path, often relying on compensatory networks in the cortex, before the overall wiring architecture of the brain becomes rigid and fixed in adulthood.
The language circuitry matures, the motor system catches up, the bypass is built, and the glitch is permanently smoothed out.
But then there is the other side of that statistic, the 20 to 35%.
The ones whose brains don't build the bypass? Let's look at a second composite case to illustrate this. A 9-year-old girl who started stuttering at age 3.
Okay.
Her neuroplastic window closed, and it did not resolve the mismatch. The wiring became fixed, and by age 9, her stutter hasn't just persisted, it has mutated into something much darker.
It changes from a physical block to a psychological fortress.
When she was 3, she just repeated the word Basal. But at 9, she is hyper-aware of the social cost. She has begun actively avoiding certain letters she knows will trigger a block.
That avoidance is so common.
Imagine, you're 9 years old, you go to a restaurant with your family, and the waiter asks what you want. She scans the menu, but she isn't looking for what she actually wants to eat.
No, she's looking for what she can say.
Desperately, she wants the hamburger. But she knows that her basal ganglia will not let her produce the H sound today. She knows she will get stuck, and the waiter will stare at her. So instead of ordering what she wants, she orders the pasta, because she knows she can safely pronounce the P.
That distinction is paramount in understanding the true burden of this condition. The stuttering itself, the neurological block in the throat, is the primary issue. But the fear, the anticipation, the avoidance, the elaborate psychological architecture built to hide the block, that becomes a secondary and often far more debilitating condition.
I was reading the perspective of the author of one of our source texts, a man who is now 64 years old. He notes that he still has a slight stutter today. He talks about growing up and refusing to just take the bullying, choosing to fight back instead. And he acknowledges a profound, sobering reality. For adults who do not experience that childhood neural rerouting, the stutter becomes a permanent fixture of their existence.
It doesn't just go away.
There is no magical age where it suddenly vanishes. The neuroplasticity window is closed, the concrete has dried.
And as those children who do not recover grow into adulthood, society's relentless, fundamental misunderstanding of the condition forces them to adapt in deeply unhealthy ways.
Because they're trying to fit in.
Exactly. The presentation of the stutter often shifts. It moves from being a highly visible, audible struggle in childhood to becoming an invisible, exhausting, covert psychological marathon in adulthood.
The architecture of covert stuttering. This is where it gets incredibly intense. When the blocks and repetitions happen over and over, year after year, the person develops what clinicians call secondary behaviors.
Yes. If you watch an adult who stutters during a severe block, you might see rapid eye blinking. You might see rapid head nodding, or foot tapping, or extreme jaw clenching.
It looks almost like a tic. Like Tourette's. Are they tics?
Oh, and it is vital to note that these are absolutely not tics. They are not nervous habits. They are deliberate, desperate, physical attempts by the nervous system to force the basal ganglia gate open.
Wait, how does blinking your eyes help you speak?
Because the brain is trying to find any physical workaround, any kinetic distraction, to push the signal through the jam. When the speech circuit is locked, a sudden, sharp physical movement, like a head nod, might temporarily jolt the supplementary motor area enough to jar the word loose.
Wow.
It's like banging on the side of a malfunctioning vending machine to get the candy bar to drop.
Banging on the vending machine. That is exactly what it looks like. But over time, the physical workarounds, the nodding and blinking, they draw too much attention. Society mocks them. So those physical workarounds evolve into complex mental workarounds.
Right.
People build these elaborate internal systems to avoid stuttering entirely. To an outside observer, they might seem completely fluent. You would never even know they stuttered. But the mental load is staggering.
The cognitive load is immense because the prefrontal cortex, the part of your brain located right behind your forehead, which is responsible for high-level planning, decision-making, and executive function, is now working in relentless overdrive.
Because it's covering for the basal ganglia.
Yes. It has to constantly monitor and compensate for the basal ganglia's failure.
Let's visualize that cognitive load. Imagine a guy named Marcus. He is operating in the high-stakes, hyper-competitive environment of a modern Manhattan corporate boardroom.
Okay.
To all of his colleagues, Marcus is incredibly articulate. He speaks with deliberate, measured pacing. He takes frequent pauses. They all think he is just a man who chooses his words with extreme, almost poetic care. He's the smart, thoughtful guy in the room.
That is the external disguise.
But what they cannot see is that internally, Marcus's mind is functioning as a frantic, high-speed thesaurus. As he is speaking a sentence to the board, he is simultaneously scanning 2, sometimes 3 sentences ahead in his mind.
He's checking for roadblocks.
He is looking out for hard consonants, the specific phonetic shapes that he knows his motor cortex will trip over on that particular day.
Because the specific trigger words aren't always the same. They can change depending on fatigue, stress levels, or even just the neurological weather of the day. Yesterday, he could say words starting with M. Today, M is a brick wall.
So he is in the middle of a sentence in the boardroom, and he sees the word marketing coming up at the end of his thought. His brain registers that the M sound is a dead end today.
The basal ganglia is not going to let that M in.
If he hits it, he will block for 5 seconds in front of the CEO. So his prefrontal cortex goes into overdrive. At the very last millisecond, he pivots. He substitutes the word marketing with brand strategy. The sentence flows. The CEO nods. No one notices a thing.
It is a remarkable feat of cognitive gymnastics.
It's a constant, high-speed word substitution designed entirely to bypass a deep brain signal failure. But then comes the Tuesday pitch.
Oh.
It is a critical presentation for a major client. He has been talking for 10 minutes, and then the mental bypass fails. He hits a word. Maybe it's the client's actual name or a specific financial figure, a word he simply cannot swap out without losing the entire meaning of the presentation.
He has nowhere to run.
He has nowhere to run. The mask slips. He tries to force it out, and for 5 agonizing seconds, the entire room goes dead silent as they watch his face contort. They watch him fight a visceral, physical battle with his own neurobiology.
And in that moment, the exhaustion he feels is total.
Total. Crushing exhaustion, because the shame he feels standing in that boardroom isn't actually about the stutter itself. It isn't just embarrassment. It is the soul-crushing fatigue of a man who has spent 40 years pretending his brain's wiring was standard, when in reality, it is a delicate, flickering circuit.
He has been running a marathon every single day while pretending he is just going for a casual stroll.
Yes.
That exhaustion is so hard for fluent speakers to grasp.
It is exactly like playing a game of Tetris, but on the absolute highest speed setting, level 15. The pieces falling from the top of the screen are words. And you have to constantly, flawlessly rotate them, fit them together, check for gaps, and clear the board before you can speak a single sentence.
William.
If you make one mistake, if you misjudge one piece, the words pile up at the top, the game freezes, and you block. And the most punishing, isolating part is that you have to play this high-speed, silent game of mental Tetris, all while looking the other person dead in the eye and pretending you are just having a casual, effortless conversation about the weather.
That constant vigilant management is exhausting in a way that is nearly impossible to quantify for someone who possesses typical fluency. And we have to ask, why do they do it?
Right. Why hide it?
Why do people like Marcus endure that massive internal effort? This desperate drive to remain covert is largely forced upon them by an external reality, a societal environment that aggressively, sometimes violently, punishes disfluency.
Which brings us to the social tax. The statistics surrounding the social reality of stuttering are deeply grim. The data indicates that roughly 60% of children who stutter are bullied specifically because of their speech.
60% breaking.
More than half of all kids with this condition face targeted harassment. And the bullying is entirely fueled by a profound public ignorance perpetuated by a series of entrenched myths.
Oh, the myths are endless. People immediately assume the person must be incredibly nervous, or they assume the person must not be very smart, or they think the person is lying.
And then there is the infuriating habit of listeners trying to help by finishing the person's sentences for them.
Which is universally despised by people who stutter.
It is deeply condescending. It strips them of their agency. To understand why the bullying is so prevalent, we have to look at the social dynamics of the condition itself. Stuttering is highly visible, and it is entirely unpredictable.
Yeah. Unlike many other neurological or developmental differences, a stutter cannot be easily hidden in a social interaction without that massive cognitive load we just discussed. It happens in public, in real time.
And it fluctuates.
Exactly, because it fluctuates. Because a child might speak completely fluently at the breakfast table in the morning, but blocks severely while reading aloud in class in the afternoon, it creates an awkward social tension. The kids in class think, wait, he could talk fine this morning, why is he faking it now?
Right.
Bullies exploit that tension.
And it is treated as physical comedy. That's the worst part.
To someone who is utterly ignorant of the neurobiology, someone who doesn't know what a basal ganglia is, mimicking a stutter looks silly. Repeating sounds, contorting the face, struggling to breathe, it is an easily imitated physical disruption.
The media has massive culpability here. Historically, movies and television have reinforced this over and over. They use the stuttering character as a reliable comedic trope. They use it as a shorthand for weakness, for cowardice, for nervousness, or for sheer incompetence. You never see the hero of an action movie stutter. You see the cowardly sidekick stutter. When an entire society is conditioned through media to view a basal ganglia timing error as a punchline, the psychological damage inflicted on the individual is catastrophic.
Which is exactly why the medical and clinical validation of this condition is so vital. It serves as a shield against that societal cruelty.
So,
well, when a person is finally evaluated by a speech-language pathologist, an SLP, the process is incredibly rigorous. It is not just someone saying, oh, you seem nervous.
What does that evaluation actually look like?
The SLP measures the exact frequency of the disfluencies. They calculate the percentage of syllables stuttered. They time the duration of the blocks down to the second.
Precise.
Very. They assess the presence of those exhausting secondary behaviors, the blinking, the physical tension. They look at the respiratory patterns.
It's a highly empirical, data-driven process.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this evaluation leads to a formal diagnosis. In the United States, under the DSM-5, the Diagnostic Manual for Psychiatric and Neurological Disorders Developmental Stuttering is officially classified as childhood onset fluency disorder.
Now, some people might hear that and think, why do we need to label it? Doesn't a label just make the kid feel worse?
It's the exact opposite. That classification is not just bureaucratic red tape or a stigmatizing label. It is a profound medical validation. It legally and medically proves to the school, to the employer, and most importantly to the individual themselves that the condition is an established neurological reality.
Right.
It is written in a medical text. It is not a character flaw. It is not a lack of confidence. It is a biological fact.
The damage of treating it like a character flaw compounds over a lifetime. It ruins trajectories. Children who are mocked stop raising their hands in class even when they know the answer. They withdraw from social development.
They don't try out for the play.
And then they become adults. And they are passed over for promotion. Why? Because employers falsely and implicitly equate physical fluency with intellectual capability and leadership skills.
It's an unconscious bias.
Exactly. And of course, high-stress situations like a job interview increase the cognitive load on the brain, which only makes the motor coordination in the basal ganglia even harder, creating a cruel, self-fulfilling feedback loop of failure.
The stress doesn't cause the stutter, but it absolutely exacerbates it.
And speaking of exacerbating it, it makes my blood boil when I hear the most common, well-meaning, yet entirely destructive piece of advice given to people who stutter. You know what I'm talking about.
Just take a breath.
Yes. Just take a deep breath or slow down. Telling someone who is locked in a neurological basal ganglia block to just take a breath is exactly like looking at someone with a compound fracture in their leg, the bone sticking out, and telling them, hey, just try walking a little softer.
It's nonsensical.
It entirely misses the mechanical, biological reality of the condition. The problem isn't that they forgot how to breathe. The problem is the gate won't open. And worse, it shifts the blame onto the person suffering.
It implies that if they just tried harder to breathe properly, or if they were just a little calmer, their brain would suddenly function normally.
Exactly.
It is an instruction based entirely on the false premise that the stutter is a respiratory choice rather than a motor timing deficit. And since society's instinctual fixes, like taking a breath, are so deeply flawed, and the condition itself is biologically rooted in DNA, we have to examine how clinical professionals actually approach treatment today.
Right. If you go online right now and search for stuttering treatments, you will see hundreds of pop-up ads for miracle cures. Programs promising to fix your stutter in a week with a special breathing technique or a dietary supplement.
Those are everywhere.
But based on everything we've just discussed, the GNPT mutation, the cellular lysosomes, the basal ganglia circuitry, a permanent cure is biologically impossible, right?
It is impossible. There is no cure for developmental stuttering. There is no pill, no surgery, no linguistic trick that permanently rewires that genetic mutation or repairs the basal ganglia deficit in an adult.
So all those ads.
Those products and programs promising a 100% cure are predatory. They prey on the desperation of people who are exhausted by the covert Tetris game.
So if there is no cure, what does an SLP actually do? How do they help?
What does exist are rigorous evidence-based therapies. The approach depends heavily on the age of the patient. For very young children, those in that 2 to 5-year-old window where neuroplasticity is at its peak, programs like the LIDCOM program are highly effective. It focuses on parent-delivered, structured praise for fluent speech and gentle, non-shaming acknowledgement of stuttered speech. It doesn't punish the stutter. It gently guides the developing brain, capitalizing on that window of neuroplasticity to encourage the brain to build those neural bypasses we talked about.
Well, what about school-aged children and adults, the ones where the concrete has dried?
For them, the approaches historically bifurcate into 2 camps. First is stuttering modification. This approach doesn't try to stop the stutter. Instead, it teaches the individual to stutter more easily.
Wait, stutter more easily?
Yeah. It teaches them to recognize when a block is coming and to slide through it with less physical tension and less panic.
So instead of hitting a brick wall at 60 miles an hour, you learn how to decelerate and bump into it softly.
The second camp is fluency shaping. This attempts to alter the entire mechanical production of speech. It teaches the person to speak with soft onsets, continuous airflow, and slightly altered articulation to minimize the physical triggers of a block.
But both of those still sound incredibly exhausting. You're still actively managing your speech mechanics in real time. But I understand the paradigm of modern therapy for adults has shifted recently. It's moving away from just fixing the physical speech.
Yes. The most profound shift in the treatment of adults who stutter is the realization that chasing absolute, perfect, 100% fluency is often an impossible and ultimately destructive goal.
Because it just reinforces the idea that the stutter is a failure.
Exactly. So modern adult therapy has shifted heavily toward cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, an acceptance-based framework. The true underlying objective in these therapies is not the elimination of the stutter. The objective is the elimination of the fear, the shame, and the avoidance behaviors that surround the stutter.
Because all that fear and shame, the stress of hiding it, that's what adds load to the nervous system. And when the nervous system is under load, what happens?
The basal ganglia's timing mechanisms become even more brittle. The glitch gets worse. Stress, fatigue, illness, they all exacerbate the frequency and severity of blocks because they drain the cognitive resources the prefrontal cortex uses to compensate.
This also perfectly explains a phenomenon that has always felt like a magic trick to me.
Got it.
The fact that many people who stutter severely when speaking can sing with perfect, unbroken fluency.
Yes. Singing is a fascinating physiological bypass. Singing relies heavily on right hemisphere brain functions. It involves elongated vowels, and most importantly, predictable rhythmic external structures.
Like the beat of the song.
Right. When you sing, the melody dictates the timing, not your basal ganglia.
The sheet music is the metronome, so your internal metronome doesn't have to work.
Exactly. It effectively bypasses the specific disrupted dopamine pathways entirely.
It all comes back to the goal of therapy for someone living with this permanently. Let's think back to that composite case we discussed earlier.
Notes.
The 34-year-old man living the exhausting covert existence, playing mental Tetris in the boardroom like Marcus.
Right.
When he finally breaks down and seeks therapy with a modern SLP, his goal isn't actually to fix his speech mechanics. His goal is to stop his world from shrinking.
He wants his life back.
Right. The success condition for his therapy isn't reading a paragraph aloud without a single repetition. It's not about achieving 0 blocks. The success condition is walking into a restaurant, looking the waiter directly in the eye, and ordering the hamburger because that is the exact meal he actually wants to eat. And if he blocks on the H for 5 seconds, he blocks. He lets it happen without shame, rather than ordering the pasta his basal ganglia allows him to pronounce easily.
That is the crux of the clinical evolution in this field. The focus shifts entirely from biological normalization to functional liberation. True treatment isn't about trying to repair a broken cellular pathway in the deep brain.
You can't fix the hardware.
It is about equipping the individual to navigate a world that is fundamentally intolerant of communicative delay, without internalizing that intolerance as a reflection of their own worth.
It's about dismantling the prison of shame built around the glitch. When you take a step back and look at the entirety of what we've unpacked today, the sheer scale of the mechanics involved is staggering. Stuttering is a profoundly complex neurobiological reality. It is rooted deep in our DNA, echoing through the lysosomal pathways of our cells, tracing back through generations of families. And it is executed by misfiring timing mechanisms deep in the basal ganglia, a failure of the brain's internal metronome. It is a physical block, an invisible biomechanical wall. It is not an emotional flaw, it is not a sign of low intellect, and it is certainly not a consequence of nervous hesitation or a lack of confidence.
Society has built an entire social landscape on the false assumption that speech is effortless. When we witness a stutter, we are not watching someone fail to communicate. We are witnessing an individual performing a continuous, high-stakes neurological marathon, fighting against their own cellular code just to be heard.